even though all regions have these kind of issues, I think that sometimes they're magnified a little bit larger in the Deep South.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Ace Atkins.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are handy links over in the sidebar on the right-hand side where you can subscribe to the show. You can find all of the archives in a handy little drop-down list, or there's a search bar where you can search for your favorite author and see if they have been on the show in these past more than 400 episodes. Thank you to our sponsors for allowing us to do this. And we've got some new sponsors coming on. Daniel Kinney, my favorite middle grade author, is just doing amazing things right now. He is publishing like a madman, but he's putting out excellent books. I buy his books for my nieces and nephews all the time. My kids are a little older now, but my nieces and nephews, I buy Daniel's books and put them in their hands. They are top shelf quality and really fun books. There's a link to Daniel's Amazon page in the show notes, and we're going to be highlighting more of his books as we go on this month. But go visit Daniel Kinney and buy his books for your favorite kids, and they will love it. Roy M. Griffiths has a new book, Bringing the Fire, The Lonesome George Chronicles, Book 2. Roy is really doing some amazing stuff in speculative fiction, and we're going to be highlighting more of those as the month goes on. But go pick up Roy's newest books. There's a link to it in the show notes. If you're a fan of alternative history or war and military thrillers, you're going to love these books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, thanks to my buddies Nick and Jason from Galaxy's Edge for sponsoring the show. I would like to welcome back as a sponsor to the show, Nick Breaker and his fantastic series, Essence. Book 1, Septima, and Book 2, Alta, are out now. Nick is feverishly working to release Book 3 now. It's in editing, and you are going to absolutely love this series. Troy, with his irrational fears, is the least likely person to lead a war, but that doesn't mean he can escape his destiny. This fantastic science fiction action series is full of great characters, great character development, lots of action, and lots of weird science fiction goodness. If you love a great character-driven story with great science fiction, you are going to love this series. Essence. 2 books are out now. Book 1, Essence. Book 2, Alta. And the 3rd book will be here soon. Get into this series now. Everyone's talking about it. Thank you, Nick Breaker. Thanks for tuning in. As always, at the end of the show, we have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl? Well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Ace Atkins on the show with me today. He has a brand new book out in his Quinn Colson novel series called The Sinners. Ace writes about my home state of Mississippi, and I'm really excited to have you on the show today. Ace, welcome.
Well, thanks, Hank. Great to be here.
Yeah. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I think when I first really had, I could go back to, being a kid in elementary school and kind of having the idea of maybe wanting to write a book someday, that kind of thing. But when it really came to me to really, want to be a writer, to be an author, and how do you do that? It really captured my imagination. Probably in high school, and I was a big fan of the Ian Fleming books and James Bond, and I read all the Fleming books, and I started reading Hemingway, and I was reading Raymond Chandler and that kind of stuff. And it was at that point it really captured my imagination. This is something I really not only want to do, but I have to do it. I just absolutely love books. I love writing. I want to get into this world, and how do I do it? So probably about that time, I was probably maybe a sophomore, junior in high school.
When you started writing novels, you write very visceral crime novels, and the setting that you choose becomes part of the cast of characters almost. What was the first novel that you wrote that got published, and what was the kind of the impetus for that novel?
The first one that was published, not necessarily the first novel that I wrote, and I use that term novel very loosely. I would say, my earlier stuff, I wouldn't really call them novels. I don't know, practice, I think I would call them. Yeah. But yeah, I started writing this book that was Crossroad Blues, which was my first published book, and I had been, I'd written another story. I'd been writing stories with this character, Nick Travers, and I was doing this when I was in my, early 20s, and I kept on playing with it, and then I'd write another book, and I'd write a short story, and I'd do this. But I think when it really came to me, I said, I think I got it. I think this is actually going to get published. I think this is really something, was really boiled down to the idea, and I was very, captured by the idea of New Orleans and Mississippi and that world, and that, kind of just that rich background as far as, just being in those places. But the idea that this backstory involving Robert Johnson, and the idea of Robert Johnson, who's a legendary blues man who, some of your listeners might know that, people say he had sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads, but in real life he had been murdered in 1938. But to take on that story, that legend of Robert Johnson, was very interesting to me. And as I started getting into the book, it took over. And at that point, I knew I really had something. And I was probably about 25 at the time. And I thought, boy, this is going to be something. And so that was the first book that was published.
What is it about this part of the world, Ace, that captured your imagination so much?
I'm from Alabama, and I've lived many different places. My family, also from the Deep South. My dad was a football coach. We moved around a lot, but the Deep South has always been home. That's always been our home base. And I've lived in Oxford, Mississippi for 20 years, and I think it's just the combination of all of it. And I think it's I try to talk to people about it's the good, the bad, the ugly. And I certainly don't write the type of Southern books that, little old ladies are going to enjoy. I don't write about, moonlight and magnolias and, pleasant little things and that kind of thing. These are gritty crime books, and, they're really, more in line with probably like Quentin Tarantino kind of stuff than anything. But I think it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I write about the things I like about the South, and I like the stuff, write about the stuff in between, but I also write about the corruption and the hypocrisy and the racism and the stuff that really stirs me up as a writer. So I think that, even though all regions have these kind of issues, I think that sometimes they're magnified a little bit larger in the Deep South.
Well, and, some of the temptation is to be a little too close to the subject matter, and to be defensive about the way the rest of the world sees, especially when you're talking about the Deep South and all of the historical issues and things, and it would be very easy to be defensive and say, yes, but we've moved past all that, and the South of today is not the South of then, and then you see remnants of things pop up, and you see that progress has been made, but maybe not the kind of progress we wish we would have made, and there are all of these undercurrents still around, which makes for this really unique gumbo of society that we have. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think you're right. I think exactly what you're talking about. It's easy to be defensive, and we're talking earlier about you being from Mississippi, and we're talking about those things. I think it is easy because it's kind of like your own family. You can talk about your own family, but you don't want anyone else talking about them. And people that are not from the South. I found myself at a conference in Los Angeles, and there were some people who had really I think maybe they've been to the Deep South once or twice, and they were trying to explain to me what was wrong with the Deep South. I was very, defensive about it. I don't like people who don't understand it to talk about it. But yeah, there's lots of issues here to address, and some of those issues, talking specifically about, race relations, that kind of thing. I think that, 10 years ago, I think that those are things that I would have been talking to you about and have been as historical storylines. I think they were things that I always felt growing up, going to high school in Alabama, as stuff that I learned about, in watching PBS and seeing that events that happened years ago. But, time has a way of these ugly events rearing their heads again. And, some of the seeds of the past are coming full circle again. And topics that I think that, were, things that we thought were in the past are coming around. And I think it's important to talk about those things. It's important to, that's a place in fiction or, in writing that we can address these ugly issues.
And you've created, I know you've written a couple of different series based around, but your new book is a Quinn Colson novel, and you have this imaginary county, Tibbehah County, Tibbehah County, and it's and you've got this great character in Quinn Colson. What does Quinn allow you to do to get maybe a fresh perspective on things, and when writing through the eyes of Quinn, how does the setting open up for you like maybe it wouldn't for Ace?
Well, I think the thing, I wanted to, and I think that on the surface level, people would think that, these are just, macho hero books, man with a gun out to, kick indoors and that kind of thing. And I mean, while there's certainly, a dose of some of that in the books, there is, these are books that the character is in law enforcement. I really try to kind of go in the opposite direction. And what Quinn allows me to do is the reason I have him, working as a sheriff is that the fact that it just opens him up to all different aspects of this county and Tibbehah County. And anytime you ride with people in law enforcement, they get to see all the different parts of this world that they're protecting. And that's why I wanted to write about a character like Quinn, is it opens him up to all different levels of society, all different parts of the county. But it's really, it's about a people and a place. It's not just about a hero with a badge and a gun. That's the absolutely least interesting part of this series. But I think Quinn has an interesting, fresh perspective that normally, as you're asking, that I would not have. Is he's a guy that was has been overseas for 10 years and he's been away from this world, and he's coming back to see it with fresh eyes. And he's seeing that many of the problems that he encountered, corruption and tribalism and broken infrastructure and that kind of things that he saw in Afghanistan are happening in his own backyard. And that was really the core of this entire series, is him coming back to clean up his own community.
What do we see Quinn Colson get himself into in this book? I know that you talked about tribalism earlier, and that really plays out in an interesting way in this book with some interesting antagonists. How did this story come to you, and what do we see Quinn get into?
Well, this is the 8th book in the series, and these books are not just, standalone stories that are, they are interrelated. I mean, you can read them separately, but they certainly tie into a larger story. And, now we're coming up on, I've been writing these books almost 10 years. Quinn has been sheriff for almost 10 years off and on. And, what he's getting into is something that links back to the very first book, which was The Ranger. And when that book starts off, it was about Quinn coming home from leave from the service and attending the funeral of his uncle, who had been the town sheriff. Is a guy named Hamp Beckett. And this book is really about how events that happened years ago are really, have a domino effect on what's going on in Tibbehah County today. So we begin the story with Hamp Beckett as he's sheriff back in 1993, and he's arresting a really mean SOB, a guy named Heath Pritchard, who's a legendary outlaw in North Mississippi. And as he's taking down Heath Pritchard, we understand that this guy is going to come back. And when he does, Sheriff Beckett is gone, and at this point, Quinn is now sheriff, and he's having to kind of deal with a mess that started a long time ago.
I've been reading the book, and it is absolutely fantastic. It you portray small town Mississippi in a way that no one else can, and I think the other person that does small town Mississippi really well is John Grisham, but in a completely different way. Sure. And you guys absolutely kind of shine a different light, with Ford County, with him, and Tibbehah County. It's like we get a full picture. And I mean that.
Well, I appreciate that. The biggest difference between us is he makes a lot more money.
Well, after this book, I don't know that that's going to be true anymore. So.
Well, I hope so. I like your thinking. I like that. I like your.
I absolutely love it, Ace. I think you're doing the Lord's work, and it's fantastic. But another series that you have your hands in is you have taken over Robert B. Parker's Spencer series, which you're doing fantastic work there as well. That is a completely different series, different character, different setting. How do you shift gears in your mind to write Spencer and then come back to like the Quinn Colson books that you do?
I have to really, separate these books entirely, and occasionally there is an overlap when I'm editing one and I'm actually beginning work on the other as far as composing the other book. But I cannot, people have asked me, can I write them at the same time where I'm writing a chapter of one and then go right to it? I cannot do it. They're so different. At the core, they're similar type stories. They're both crime novels. They, both involve criminals and, bad guys and good guys and that kind of thing. But to write about the world of Boston and to tune my ear to that type of dialect and that kind of feel of that city is a completely different process. And what I do is, usually when I'm starting a Spencer book is I'll go up and I have many friends in Boston and go spend time up there and kind of get a feel of that city and the way people talk and the rhythms of everything. And then I sit down and I start writing another Spencer book. And then of course for a Quinn book, all I have to do is go out my, back door and here I am in North Mississippi, and I can go down to the local Walmart and hear people talk and get a feeling of that world too. Yeah. So, it's just really kind of getting zeroed in and tuned into the world that I'm writing about. And, for the last Spencer book, which was Old Black Magic, it was a lot about high-end art theft and about, Rembrandts and Vermeers and high-end art. And so I spend a lot of time at the museums and Museum of Fine Art in Boston. And then when I started writing Quinn for the Sinners, at the end of last year, I was going to dirt track racing in rural Mississippi. So very different worlds, but, it's all the same. It's all research. It's all characters. It's all people, and it's all a lot of fun.
Does switching gears and going to Boston and then coming back to North Mississippi, do you think that has a positive net effect on your creativity? Does it help you to get away from characters for a while and get away from settings? And then when you come back, do you feel more invigorated?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if that's something that, how long I'll, continue to do that. It's very difficult doing, both series. I mean, there's a lot of work. Spencer's a character that I have always loved. I greatly admired Robert B. Parker. He was a hero to me, and to be able to keep that character going was something very personal. And I do. These characters come from the same place. I was inspired by the same people that inspired Parker, and Hammett, Chandler, the Old West, great Western movies, Western literature. And so even though the setting is different, the dialect is different, this type of storytelling is very similar, and I think Parker and I share that, that bond very much.
How do you balance characters the way you do, Ace? You talked about that. It's all about characters, no matter which one you're writing. And we talked about this, about showing the good, the bad, the ugly. When you get inside of a character's head, especially when you have a recurring hero, if you will, and I'm saying that in air quotes, it's easy to make them very heroic. But you show them as people really are. Is there ever a temptation to weigh a character less than real life, and how do you pull that back to keep characters real?
Well, I think, going back to the whole idea of writing Quinn Colson, I have never been a reader or a fan of the Teflon-coated hero,
right,
and the overly macho hero who, is always seems to, is bed hopping and is always, taking down the bad guys without, any type of strain and that kind of thing. I find those books kind of tedious, and I like to write about real people. And that's really, I wanted Quinn not to be somebody who was like some, special ops guy or a Navy SEAL or something larger. I wanted a big guy that been in the U.S. Army and he came home to get a job. And he's like a guy that we all know. He's somebody that, I know a lot of guys like Quinn Colson. And that's really the idea. I wanted him to be an everyman kind of character. And so, going from that idea that he does make mistakes, and sometimes I get letters from readers. I mean, I had him in a, he was involved with a married woman at one time, and I got letters from readers saying, "How could you do that? This is supposed to be a moral character." And I said, "Well, he's a real man. He's a person with issues and that kind of thing." And so when I keep that grounded to authenticity and to Quinn Colson being an everyday kind of guy, I think that keeps him very interesting. If he was a larger than life character, I think that I would grow bored pretty quickly.
Yeah. How many more novels do you foresee in the Quinn Colson series?
I don't really see, for lucky for me and my good friends at Putnam, I don't, my publisher, I don't necessarily see an end to the story. And I have written, I wrote an earlier series in my career where I did see an end in sight. I did see a limited amount of stories I could write with that character. But the idea of writing a character like Quinn, which is a really kind of basic, easy setup. He's a guy, ex-military guy, comes home, he becomes the sheriff in this, this rural county. There are unlimited story possibilities. So I think that as long as, the fans want him to return, as long as I'm engaging them, as long as I am fascinated by the character and have more stories involved, I don't necessarily see an end in sight, much like Parker did with Spencer or with Jesse Stone. I think that there are unlimited possibilities for this character.
And I feel like you've got lots of opportunity to keep torturing Quinn. So,
well, here, I mean, as we talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, I'm sure I could open up the paper this morning and look exactly and find about 10 new stories, ideas as far as corruption and crime and things that are happening in the Deep South. So not only is, Quinn a fascinating character that I like to return to, there is also a lot of work for him there's a lot of work to be done.
Right. Ace, I know you've got another interview right behind this one. We're crunched for time, but thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. The new book, The Sinners, is out. It's the newest book in the Quinn Colson series. Ace, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you online if they want to follow along with your work?
They can find me as very easily. You can find me on Facebook. I've got a very active Facebook page where I interact with fans. You can also go to my website, which is very cleverly titled aceatkins.com.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ace. We're going to send everyone to pick up a copy of The Sinners.
Thank you, Hank. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final, if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle. No, rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought, and then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise, headless, and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth, the nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.